want to welcome you to our webinar entitled Listening to the Voice. Whoops. We are a small congregation. Help. Sorry. I am your host, Nancy Kaufman, and I'm a senior consultant for church safety. And Michael Danner will be the main presenter, and he is Associate Executive Director of Church Vitality in Mennonite Church USA, and also the denominational minister for church safety, supporting area conferences, congregations, and pastors in their ministry. Both Michael and I come with experience in serving as pastors in a congregation, as conference ministers, and then now within the national office in Church Vitality and under Church Safety. Tonight's gathering is in webinar format, so all attendees are muted and the chat is disabled. We will, however, be posting some links in the chat, resources to help share with you. This webinar is, though, being recorded, and you will receive the link in a following email. That link, then, you can find the recording on Mennonite Church USA under Safe Church webpage, but it also is available on our YouTube channel. Please feel free to use the question and answer feature in the bottom of your screen. Only the panelists will be able to see your questions. We will also answer some of the questions that were pre-submitted earlier. Know that this webinar is being recorded and can be found again, I said earlier, on the Safe Church web page of MCUSA. So we are really glad to have you here with us, and I would like to open with prayer at this time. God, we are your committed people to you. We ask that you shape our hearts and our minds to embrace your heart and your ways so that our faith communities may be blessed. May we all hear, learn, and grow. Thank you, God, for your presence. In Christ's name, amen. So, Michael, you want to begin?
Yeah, thank you, Nancy. And good evening, everybody. It's good to be with you. You can only assume if you registered and came to this webinar that you're probably leading in a smaller-ish church, and you have some questions about how to do that and how to do that well, how to engage in abuse prevention, and also accountability resources or processes in your church. I want to start by basically saying, like, if you're a part of a smaller church, you're in great company. And so we're going to talk a little bit about, the average size of congregations, what is happening in across the United States in terms of Christian churches and their average size. And so in terms of average congregation size, the National Congregations Study found that the average church has just 70 active members, while the median congregation welcomes 70 regular participants, and that includes both adult and children. That means that, let's go about the median church has actually only about 65 people attending each week, which means that half of all churches have fewer than 60 people in weekly worship service. All right, so when you think about your church and the number of people that show up, over half of churches in the United States have less than 65 people or 65 fewer in attendance. The small church reality, also 7 in 10 churches, 70% have 100 or fewer weekly worship service attendees, which means there's a significant concentration of churches at the smaller end of the spectrum. But this one's a little bit interesting. Over half of all church attendees actually go to 9% of congregations. And so like much in American cultural life, there's a disparity between the largest churches, and there's a few very, very large churches, but most churches are actually smaller, with over half of them with 65 fewer members, but over 70% of them with 100 or fewer. So, if that describes you, you're in good company. It's there's a lot of smaller communities, yeah, uh, in the U.S. The other thing that's worth noting is that the average U.S. congregation saw a decline in attendance. So over the last three census, so the last, that would have been 20 years, three census figures, the participation of church or church attendance has gone down in every county within the United States. All right. So that even means if you're in a county where it seems like there's a church that's growing or getting bigger, there are still fewer people going to church in that county than there were 10 years ago or 20 years ago. And so this is a continued trend that we see in American cultural life, with the fastest growing segment of religious life in the United States are people that identify as what they call nones, Nones. They're people that consider themselves spiritual but identify with none of the traditions, Christian, Muslim, Jewish, or Buddhist, or other thought, other frames of organized religion. So that's where we're at in American cultural life. The other thing about being in America is that we tend to believe that bigger is better. And so we've grown up in this cultural context, where the person with the most money, the biggest house, the fastest car, the biggest business, all those kinds of things tend to carry more cultural weight or status or power than what is small, or smaller. Or so we go to big box stores, not so many mom and pop stores, things of that nature. So when you live in a context that says bigger is better, being told you're small and that a lot of people are small sometimes doesn't make you feel good at all. It still makes you feel like, well, if you're not big, you're not thriving. And the first thing when we talk about being a small church is we've got to disconnect those two ideas. The reality is there can be large churches that are quite healthy, and there can be large churches that are actually quite unhealthy. And there certainly are small churches that are unhealthy, right? There's reasons why maybe they're smaller, but there's also a lot of small communities that are very, very healthy faith communities. So we have to separate this idea that size, or the size of a congregation, has anything at all to do with whether that's a thriving faith community according to the way of Jesus. So, from a start, let's just let's just start there, I guess. That size and vitality are not they're not connected, right? And so that's the best place to start. I'll turn it back over to Nancy a bit to talk about kind of how we approach even this subject when we think about this.
Yes, and Michael and I spent a lot of time talking about what it does mean to be a small congregation, and one of the things I think it is so easy for us to compare ourselves to larger congregations. Then we look at what they have, and then we determine what we don't have, and then we feel incompetent or unsure of ourselves, or what can we do because we are so small. And there is scripture where it shows, the smallest of the small sometimes did something major that affected the whole community. So we strongly believe that every congregation is given the gifts that they need to do what in their particular area, what they need to do. And they're given those gifts by the Holy Spirit, and they're also to be able to do what God calls them to do in that place. Our power for ministry comes from who God is, not who we are. And I think that, the dependence we need to have more on God. God, you called us to this place right now. This is our size, or right now, this is what we're having to face. Help us think through what we need to do. So our confidence comes from God, not from size, not from budgets, not from buildings, not from members. Um, And there are many blessings to being a smaller church. Smaller churches often enjoy a higher level of relationships and connections. It is easier for individuals to know and to be known. Also, change can often happen more quickly if the church is wanting to change. And so putting our trust in God as to what God might want us to do is very, very important. Smaller churches are often more adaptable and flexible. It's easier to turn a little boat around in the river than it is to turn a big steam ship around in the river. So we got to remember that. Because systems are less complex in small congregations, they require fewer inputs. Pulling off of a meal or having a special event at the last minute or changing the worship service at the last minute to address certain issues at that particular time. It also involves fewer people and fewer moving parts to that. Small churches are often people focused rather than program or structure focused. And that can be a drawing point for people wanting to come to your church. It is harder to remain anonymous. So if you want to hide and don't want to be noticed, you go to a large church and sit in the back pew. But in a smaller church, you most likely will be noticed right away and can maybe be incorporated very easily into the life of the congregation. Smaller churches often have higher participation with members. Once in a while, if a church is getting sort of sluggish and people are having low confidence in themselves as a church, then sometimes it ends up a few people in the church are doing everything. And if that gets to be the place, obviously the church needs to reevaluate, how badly do they want to continue to be a church and how can we share these pieces? But again, it does not have to be all on one person or a couple of people. Smaller churches are often people focused versus program or structured focus. So, like I said, it is harder to remain anonymous. Smaller churches are highly more participatory. It is harder to sit on the sidelines. And yeah, so if you're a small church, don't keep beating yourself over the head that you are a smaller church. Ask what are the special things that you have that maybe a larger church doesn't have, or what are the things that you can do that maybe a larger church can't do as easily or as quickly? Michael?
Yeah, another thing that's really helpful to remember, and I don't know when this occurred to me. As a pastor coming of age, like in the 90s, early 2000s, in the midst of the church growth movement, mega churches were kind of all the rage, right? Everybody paid attention to them, paid attention to the methodology and things like that. And I began to notice that there's something about Anabaptism in and of itself that actually works against that idea. Our understanding that the church is a gathering of believers in a relationship of Gelassenheit, of mutual submission to one another, that actually discern things together. They just read the scripture together. They discern application together. They're multivocal in their leadership, such that every person has a voice in the decision making. All of that works against the notion of a very large church. And so uh, just try this out at this thought experiment. Think about areas that you know of, or maybe where you come from, where there's lots of Mennonites. Are there a few very, very large churches, or are there more like smaller churches? Like where I'm at in Elkhart County, we have like 20 or even 30, like 150 to 200 member churches, right? Or around that size. We don't have one 4,000 member church, even though there's that many Anabaptists. There's something about the way that we understand what it means to be community together that starts to actually break down as a church gets bigger, right? And so this high level of relationships, high level of participation. All of this is actually, I would say, almost a result of who we are as Anabaptists and Mennonites and the way that we understand followers of Jesus and community relate to one another to be the church. So that's really, really important. And it kind of dovetails off with this idea that's really um, really, really important. And so like every church, like no matter the size, I would say this, health comes through a focus on vision and mission. It comes from understanding who you are, how God has made you, what gifts God has placed in you, and what God has called you to be and do. As you focus on that, and as you live into those realities within your community, as you act that out in your relationships with your neighbors, then you can thrive. And communities like that, I mean, incidentally, that are healthy, where people are welcomed, where people are included, where people have high degrees of relationship and support and engagement. Ironically, those communities do tend to grow as well. They tend to be able to welcome more people. And even if they don't grow numerically in size, let's say on Sunday morning at 10 o'clock, they often have a reach beyond their size in the community of people that are impacted by the relationships, the service, the neighbor, yeah, the neighborhood stuff, um, the thrift shops, the things that you do in the community. So that's really, really important to kind of set up um, kind of where we're going next. So um, let's turn like to this context of safe church. So we talk a bit about small churches, a little about being Anabaptist churches, help right size that, help you know that like you have everything that you need to do what God's called you to do. How does that then relate to safe church? How does that relate to abuse prevention and accountability in the church or in the local church? And I'm gonna just like Nancy, like tell us a little bit about like why we're even having this webinar? Like what prompted this webinar?
Well, I often get a lot of calls from small congregations across the country, and was realizing there is a general theme, well, the the thing again, which I said earlier, is well, we're small, so we don't know what we can do, or we realize there's certain things we can't do. And it's us, to me, it seemed like some of our small congregations have low self-esteem. Again, because you probably are comparing yourself to the large congregations and you see they're doing maybe 10 things over in the community, and there's no way that you could do 10 things. And the other thing too, that I do have a story about a small congregation. When I was conference minister, um, there was a small congregation here in Indiana, and I was told by the person I was replacing, well, this church is small, very, very small, and so they are going to probably die in 2 years. Well, I want you to know that was back in 2000. I was told that that church is still thriving. So that's, 26 years later. But the thing that I remember them doing that encouraged me to think about encouraging other small churches is the fact that, yes, we are small. We will probably die, but we haven't died yet. What could we do in our community? And they found some very creative ways of working into the community that actually, once I visited them a couple times and then talked to some of the local people, even people who didn't necessarily go to that church. They were really the only church in the community, didn't really go to that church. But if you ask them, they would say that church was their congregation because the people in that congregation had related very directly to the people in the community. And so I always remember that, yeah, we probably will die, but until we die, what can we do? And they did some very creative ways, and I could tell more stories. So if you want to hear more stories about that, you can contact me later. So that's why we do it.
Yeah, put it in the
To
Q&A.
encourage.
Say, Nancy, tell me more stories, right? Um, yeah, so in general, I would affirm this too. What often happens when it comes to safe church is that many smaller congregations express to us that they're overwhelmed because of the
Yeah.
size. And so Mennonite Church USA and area conferences release prevention and accountability. It's a 80 something page document. There's two different sections. There's lots of forms. There's lots of processes, and it can seem like that's pretty overwhelming. And the question becomes like, how do we implement this right in our congregation, or what makes sense relative to us? And the first thing I would say is that it is important to remember that that scale matters in some ways, right? So that the resources or the approach to Safe Church in a smaller congregation with 10 to 12 or 30 people with a handful of children is going to be obviously much different than what it is for a 3,000 member church. And so oftentimes when I think through this, I ask myself, what would be easier, like, or what would be, is it providing a safe space for children, youth, and vulnerable adults in a highly relational community, where everyone is known, or providing a safe space for children, youth, and vulnerable adults in a large community with many different people in and out, such that persons are much less well known. For me personally, and maybe this is because I've often been in smaller congregations as well. The high levels of trust and relationality in those spaces do make it a little bit easier, although there are some pitfalls we'll get to later, is that relative to that as well. But so for a small church, when you think about scale, there aren't often as many challenges for all of the reasons listed above. When I first was I was a children's pastor, or a Christian education director for a church in the largest suburb in Chicago. And this would have been in the 90s, late 90s. And I came from a small rural community which was quite a lot different. And there were things that I just simply didn't understand that related to scale and the fact that we didn't know people well, and also didn't often know people's families well. And so real simple questions like who can pick up a child from the nursery became something that needed processes, check-in procedures. The person that drops off the kid is the only person that can take the kid out, even if it's another parent. There's all kinds of things you had to put in place because of the scale of that. Often in a smaller church, you work at those things kind of more organically. But for a small church, the question is where would I start? To some degree, it's a difficult question to answer in a webinar format in one sense, and that is that each small church is unique, and we don't actually know what particular issue your church might be facing as it's smaller. So, if you would like some particular questions that you might have, use the Q&A to write those, and that might make it a little bit easier for us. But normally, I would recommend like starting in these ways. And it's really fairly simple because you're a smaller congregation. The first thing I would actually focus on is Sunday morning. Like, what kind of Sunday morning activities do you have? Do you have nursery care? Do you have Sunday school? Do you have programming that involves children and vulnerable adults? Like, if you have any of those things happening, that's where you want to start your focus. And the first thing you would do is begin to develop a safe church policy. Now, the policy again will scale to the particular needs of your church. If what you're dealing with is simply there's a small number of children in a Sunday school classroom, you might start with issues of very simply like that you'll need to have two adults in the room, some of the basics, and that the space that the folks meet in will have to be transparent. So people will be able to see into it, and interruptible so that people could walk in or witness what's happening. These are basic level kinds of things. Doors need to have windows in them, and two adults need to be present whenever there's minors present. So the nursery, the child care, the Sunday school, that's where you would want to start. And so your safe church policies should just reflect what the needs are based upon what you're doing programmatically. If it's not an issue that your church has, you probably don't need a system where people check in and you give them a digital ID so that during the worship service, if their child's crying, that number pops up and you need to go. That's something that a large church would do. You don't need to do that. There's certain things that you don't need to do. So some of that is just using common sense, starting with Sunday morning programming, nursery care, Sunday school, and then having those policies. If you have a youth group, then you move to that space. Anytime you're getting minors together, either teenagers, elementary students for midweek program, vacation Bible school. These are the kind of the hot spots where you would need to have very basic safe church policies that you would then follow. So what policies and procedures does the church need to create in order to make these spaces safe? And again, it's adults and it's interruptible space. The other then side of that is background checks. Anybody that's working with children or vulnerable adults, you should have some process for background checks. Now, for a small church, if you only have a handful of people that are working with children, obviously it's not as expensive to do those initial background checks. And if people stay in ministry for a longer period of time, then you don't have to repeat them as often. So this is what I mean by saying that some of these things will scale with the size of your church. And what may seem overwhelming, like if I was in a large church, this might be a big budget item. If you're only working with a handful of people in this position, it can be quite affordable. If they stay in those positions longer, then again, you don't have to do it quite as often. So those are really the first kind of on-ramps to doing this in a small church, right? And you want to keep it as simple as possible. The third thing that you would then add is you do need to have at least some, it can be a very simple process, but you need to have some process whereby people can file any sort of complaints or grievances if they need to. And so often in a small church, that will mean that there's a person, maybe it's a pastor, maybe it's a staff person, maybe it's a volunteer, that this is the person we've identified that if you have an issue, you need to report or you need to talk to this person. And that needs to be, it can be simple, but it needs to be written out and it needs to then be followed. So those are the very basics, right? That how do we keep kids safe? How do we ensure that when minors are engaged in the church that we have people that are working with them that have been vetted? And if there does happen to be a problem, who do people tell, right? Because sometimes if it's nobody's responsibility or it's everybody's responsibility, it's nobody's responsibility. So you need to have a very simple, in the event of this, contact this person. The other thing that you would also want to do is make sure that you would have notifications in your church, and normally we would put these up in the men's and women's restrooms, where if anyone has experienced any sort of abuse within the church, not so much in safe church areas, but in any context within the church, that they know who to report to outside of your church. Sometimes if misconduct happens, if it happens through a pastor in a small church, it's very, very difficult to tell anyone else in the church. And so you would also want to let them know, people in the church know that if you've experienced any sort of misconduct or abuse or even questionable situations that you don't know quite how to deal with, that these are the people that you call the conference safety liaison, who is a part of your area conference to support your ministry, or the national office, which is where Nancy and I work. On our website, there is a resource that has a poster of when to approach that has contact information that you can fill out and hang out for those reasons. So those are really like the on-ramps for when you're a small church. Get to know your conference safety liaison. That's a really important person. And then also engage Safe Church. We're here to help. And so as a church with an MCUSA, if you're connected to an MCUSA conference, you can pick up the phone, you can call Nancy, you can call me. We will answer any questions you have. We'll do what we can to help you in any way we can. We can point you to resources if you're having trouble finding them on our site, or if you're looking for a resource that we don't have at the moment. We can help connect you to the things that you need to do your ministry well. Let's
Well, looking at some of the questions, Michael, too, I want to go back though before we hit one of those questions when you talk about the nursery and Sunday school care and that kind of thing, is that oftentimes it is good if you do an assessment of your building, like where are your bathrooms located? Are they located in a faraway place, in the basement, or where do you stick your children's classes? And so that may determine what you need to do to make sure that your church is a little safer to be used. The one question that somebody had here, and I'll throw it out to you, is, well, here, Mike, I'll let you do this one. Is there anything we should be thinking about as renters in our worship space? Do you want to take that one?
So, if I understand it correctly, so this would be that the church is the congregation that meets rents the space from somebody else. Um, so if I'm reading that right, so let's say
Mhm.
your congregation rents space from another church. I mean, obviously, or another building, or if you're in a school or some of those things. Um, yeah, one of the things, I mean, that you'd obviously want to be most concerned about security wise in a building that you don't quite own is the flow of access to the building. The things you don't know is who else has keys, who else can get in and out of the building, when they'll enter and when they're not. And so you need to be pretty attentive to who is supposed to be in the space, relative to the church, and take some measures to make sure that you just know that the area itself is safe, that other people can't get in the building. If you're even if you're worshiping after another congregation, I would come into the building and sweep the building, for instance. Not so much like law enforcement, but in a sense, like let's go through the whole building. Let's see who still may be in here. Um,
Mhm.
there was one church in our conference that met in a municipal building. Like it was a nice space, but it was used for all kinds of things during the week, and even it would be open ahead of sometimes worship to do some social service kind of stuff, and then it would be open to the church for worships. But there's all kinds of people that are in and out of that building, so you need to make sure that you have a good handle on who's in the building, who's supposed to be in the building, who might not be into the building. And it probably would be good to have somebody that has some sort of de-escalation training or any of those kinds of things that could actually, if there's somebody in the building that isn't supposed to be there, how do you manage that situation and make sure that people in the building are safe? Um, some of the basic screenings, like Nancy's talking about too, relative to just safe church. Like if you choose a location for your Sunday school, and you don't have many adults, for instance, watching the class, how do you ensure that you can get a child, for instance, that might have to go to the restroom there and back safely, that they would not engage other folks? So some of it's just about being able to keep an eye on folks. That's what I would be concerned. Obviously, I'm just guessing a little bit. I don't know the specifics, but those are the kind of things that I would think about in a rental situation.
Yeah, I think with the rental situation, from the person, you may need to know what the rental place, what their insurance company requires too, because a lot more insurance companies are requiring churches to have safe protection policies. So that is good to know. Also, I would add, sometimes, somebody has left, but you haven't received the key back from them. Or sometimes you may, depending on what the situation is, it may be time to change all the locks on your doors every once in a while. That might seem extreme, but for certain situations where there has been some issues, you may need to do that. One of the other questions, and I can take this one, is it asks if there are um, any small church policies. When we work with congregations, when I do consulting with congregations, it is often, you don't have to reinvent the wheel for what the policy needs to be the best for you. But one of the things I really stress is that you do have a clear understanding of what your mission is as to why you want to do this. And if you can articulate that, then that can help shape the policy. But I have a lot of samples of policies, and I could, start pulling out, like you want something for overnight stays. I could be looking through some of those policies and pull out what other churches have said, and then you could decide what fits you, what makes sense to you. And there's nothing wrong with this. There's not plagiarism in developing a safe church policy, unless it's not plagiarism, but it's not helpful if it doesn't come, from your heart, mind, and soul as to why you're doing this. And this somebody, another church has worded it very nicely. You can copy that. So that is good. Um, Okay, now there's one question here. I see one difficulty we have. Whoops, I lost it. It went away. One difficulty we have as a church is to face is the presence of RSOs that have attended our church and dealing with how to look at each situation and implement the policy effectively. A young man was baptized who is a 15-year-old, difficult circumstances, had his father occasionally attending last year. We recently learned that his father was a registered sex offender. That's what SR or RSO means. And his offense is possession of sexual, got to get the whole thing here,
Yes,
sexual,
ma'am.
yeah, sexual, I lost the thing here, just a minute. Hang on.
Probably child sexual abuse or
Oh,
child
possession of
safety.
sexual or nude content of a minor on a device. Do we inform the congregation that this young man's father is an RSO? And when the father has been informed of the policy and knows that he cannot engage in worship service at our church sponsored activities where minors are present and understands and won't attend. And how do we handle this variety that they have of the different registered sex offenders? Michael, you want to take it and I can
Well,
add to it?
yeah, well, I mean, the short answer is actually we've done separate webinars on that subject in particular, especially on how to write those kind of. So you need there would need to be within like in your Safe Church policy, a section that dealt with RSOs and how you would respond to that. But that's a bit of a yeah. So not necessarily common for small churches in general, but if that does happen, I would just encourage you to reach out. And there's also already I think we have at least two webinars on that subject. And then there's also a resource that we
Great.
have that can help you think through that. Because it is a more difficult situation, and then you're also navigating all kinds of relational context around that as well. Um, yeah, I'm guessing Nancy, you're seeing that in the chat because I'm looking into Q&A and I didn't see that question. We have
Yeah, I think it
we had
did
a
come.
question in the Q&A about any recommendations for background checks or vetting for volunteers that may be undocumented immigrants. Um, that is a really specific kind of use case that we also deal with around credentialing as well because if you're a credentialed minister in MCUSA, you have to go through background screenings, but having undocumented status obviously makes it difficult for you to do FBI background checks and some of the things that we normally do. Um, and normally in those cases, what we encourage is just a highly relational kind of approach, so that the people we ensure that the conference and the congregation knows the people well. And then you have just basic oversight in place that would be common for these kinds of things. But you would be pretty attentive to following all those rules because you're taking extra responsibility. You will be taking on extra liability risk if that person were to offend. But you also don't want to exclude people from ministry that are perfectly fine just because of legal risk and things of that nature, right? So it's a bit of a tricky situation, but in one sense, the background checks are not relevant. You're not going to be able to do those in quite the same way. If there's no language barrier, sometimes there's a language barrier, but our conference safety liaisons are also able to have conversations with folks, to ask questions or have conversations around people's understandings of abuse, child safety, protection of vulnerable adults and minors. That's really, really important. Making sure that you do have kind of written expectations, like when is it appropriate um, to engage people? When is it inappropriate? Like, what are the guidelines? So you would just follow all of the basic rules. You just don't have this backstop of a background check that lets you know that they don't have any past history. But you would still want to do all the same things, even to a little bit more attentive degree.
Mhm.
in that
We
situation.
do. Yeah, and we do within Safe Church recommend that if you do have a policy that everybody who volunteers needs to know what that policy is and actually sign a covenant. It would be helpful to sign a covenant to say that they will abide by that thing. I think with a smaller church, and this could be true in a larger church too, we often talk about, well, we need to train our teachers and volunteers on how to best work with children and the safety issues. But I think the whole congregation needs to be educated on the policy that you are dealing with. And even within the new Prevention of Polity booklet, I think it resource there, emphasizes or suggests a behavioral covenant with the church. And I think that's not too bad of an idea. All of our pastors and Michael and I, we all have to do healthy boundaries training. And so I think the importance that you can easily do that in your congregation to do some healthy boundaries training with the whole congregation. And if you need help, like Michael said, you've got your conference safety liaison, safe church, safe church. My lights just went out.
Nancy didn't move enough and her automatic lights turned off.
I was trying to not talk too fast for the interpreters. Didn't move. Anyway, but yeah, I forget now what I was talking about when that went off. Yeah, well, I was saying that all of the credentialed people have to have healthy boundaries training, but I think it would be helpful for the whole congregation to look at, and it doesn't matter the size you are, how are we going to interact with each other? How are we going to respect each other? How are we going to address if one of us is sort of acting like a bully in the congregation? Oftentimes we don't want to address those firsthand. But I think to be a healthy congregation, that is important. And
Agree.
if you're wanting additional training things besides what you can find, you can contact our office, and we do trainings by Zoom oftentimes, or go to local congregations to do some of those. So there are a lot of resources around. And so if you want to call and say, well, what are the resources? We can help you find some.
Yeah. So I'm going to roll through some of the Q&A stuff that were that people put in the Q&A. And so one question is, how do we go about getting background checks done? And so if you go actually to the Mennonite Church USA website, we actually do have a service through our Safe Church ministry that can help you get background checks for your volunteers. And that would be the simplest. That would be a place to start. It'll explain on there what the background checks cost and what they cover. And you can get that resource. So that's something we've been doing for about the last year and a half, maybe, with MCUSA. There are also other organizations that will do these kinds of background checks for you. A good starting place is to see what we're doing and the cost, and if that fits with you, that's fine. If the only caution is that, like, all background checks are not created equal, so you might find something that might be a little less expensive, but it might not cover as much. So, good starting point to start with MCUSA's Safe Church website. There's a link on doing that as well. So, there's a couple of really specific questions on sex offenders in the church, and again, that's a highly important topic, and it's one that comes with a lot of kind of anxiety, and this is it's a really important topic. I'm just going to say, like, for the purpose of this particular website, like, or webinar, that's probably not something we want to spend a lot of time addressing. It is something that's really, really important for each church to discern, and we've already covered that in a couple other webinars. So I'm going to send you two places. One, I'm going to send you to those webinars if you didn't see them. And then if you have very specific kind of application questions, like, in our church, X, Y, and Z happened, pick up the phone and talk to Nancy and I, and we can help walk through that with you as either like thought coaches or just folks that are having a conversation with you in terms of applying the policy. It's also very specific to each congregation, because each congregation discerns for themselves what kind of resources, what kind of calling they have relative to walking with and alongside like ROS folks. Like so, and so it's really hard to make general kind of statements about that, right? Because each church is discern for themselves what they're able to do and how they're able to do that. So I would say, yeah, let's if you have those kind of questions, let's go ahead and yeah, reach out to us, and we'll be glad to talk with you through those. Um, and so, yeah, somebody's bringing up a really good question about um, and I'll just read both of these. They say I observe anxiety in small congregations not because they are small, but because they are experiencing decline and grieving loss, struggling to adapt and figure out what needs to change. Would that change how they prioritize safe church concerns? And then the follow-up, same person. I didn't mean to say that church safety is a lower priority for declining congregations, but that grief, loss, decline may impact their willingness or capacity to take steps towards safe church practices. For example, if they say we don't have any children, and I think that's actually legitimate. Like, so if your congregation has been or experienced decline, and it used to be a 100 members plus or 150 people with lots of children, and now you're down to a point where it's much smaller. There aren't many children. Maybe you'll have children or grandchildren that come up for special holidays or special events. How much time and energy would you actually give to this? And I would say, look, I would scale this to what is actually happening like in your congregation. And so the first thing I would say is any time you could reasonably expect to have children present, you do need to have thought out how are you going to ensure that that the church is safe for that event or for that day. So if you know Easter Sunday is going to have a lot of families, there might be some kids you're not used to that. How do you approach nursery care? How do you think through like church safety, the number of adults in the nursery? How are you going to approach that? So be thoughtful and be intentional before that time. But if you know that like 50 weeks out of the year, there really are no children in your church, um, you don't need a robust policy right at that point. Like, and so when you're thinking about kind of how you spend missional energy, I would say go back to vision, mission, who's God called you to be, and maybe anticipate a time where that might be the case. But in terms of triage and priority and things of that nature, if there's no children present, or no vulnerable adults or no folks in those categories, then it obviously becomes a lesser priority in terms of time, resources, and energy. Um, but also don't use that there are no kids here, quote unquote, as an excuse, because sometimes it's chicken and the egg. Sometimes churches don't have kids because they're not real terribly friendly places for families and young families. So think through some of that. I would say think through some of that strategically, but you have to think about what's the reality in the church, and how you would do that. But again, anytime you can reasonably expect that a child might be present in the church, make sure you have a real intentional process for that. Maybe you don't have, maybe you've not been able to have background checks, but you can get creatively about these things. Like, so most churches I've ever been in, and this is a big generalization, but almost every church I've been in has elementary school teachers or some teachers, some people that might serve in areas where they're already vetted, they're already licensed to work with children. They might be mandated reporters. These would be great folks to try to tap on the shoulder and say, hey, would you be willing to serve in a nursery for Easter Sunday if children are present? So there's some creative ways that you can get at providing safety intentionally that also scale with like the needs of the church, right? So do you need 5 people with background checks in a 30-member church that has no children? Probably not. But there's probably folks you can identify that already have those kinds of yeah, those kinds of backgrounds. I've never been in a Mennonite church at least that doesn't have some teachers like. But I don't know if that helps answer that question at all.
Well, one of the things too, often, and we even talk about it, even with the prevention and accountability, you were already making a list of things. Oh, maybe we should add this or that. I think sometimes we think we need to start with a big flushed out policy in order to work on that kind of thing. And I always think policy should be fluid. So, I think we've been stressing, start with where you're at do a couple things that you can do and get that in place, and then you can maybe add more, or you discover, oh, we need to add something about this as you're continuing on with your life and that. But I think you do need to think about something. The church I told you that I was told was going to die, and now 20 years later is still alive. They're not, they're really, really small, really, still struggling, but boy, they still fit into the community. But the one thing I was impressed by, in the bulletin every Sunday, it said who was going to be in the nursery. And they did not have children, but they were prepared just in case there were children. And I think, if a new family comes to your church, and, you do want to be stepping up to the plate for that. Another thing that I want to stress with small congregations and the safety in your building, sometimes congregations will give the best spots to meet with Sunday school or whatever to the adults, and then relegate all the children into the basement. And if it's a small congregation, I think it would be good to think about who needs what spaces, and maybe do more of a mix for safety within the church. So,
So
um,
these are great questions. I want to shift a little bit just for a few minutes, and if you have other questions, go ahead and write them down. But like we need to be clear that there are also challenges, right, that come from small churches. And so
mhm.
while being highly relational, smaller, everybody's known and can be known is a advantage. Also, it can be a challenge. So I just want to talk a bit about a few challenges before our time runs out. First of all. Um, Sometimes in small churches with high levels of relationships, the church thinks they are not at risk because they know everybody already. And of course, one of us, whom we know and love, couldn't possibly do any of these kinds of things. In almost every case there's misconduct in the church, it's by somebody that's known to the church. It's not somebody that came in from the outside. It's usually somebody that's there that's known and trusted. So therefore, um, there is a need for things like background checks. I have had churches say, "Well, look, we know everybody so well, we don't need to do this." Actually, you do, and that's also because, yeah, sometimes people that engage in predatory behavior actually groom whole communities, and so it's to their advantage that you trust them, and they're very good at that. I'm not saying you should be suspicious of everybody, but you also need to do background checks. It's very simple and it's very cost effective and it's easy to do. Um, so when people say, well, we're so small and we know everybody, so there's no need for things like background checks, that logic can actually play into patterns and behaviors of potentially predatory persons. So just because you're small does not mean you don't have to do your due diligence, which includes policies and background checks for all persons working with children's, teens, vulnerable adults. And like Nancy said earlier, you do have to be intentional about physical spaces. Often older buildings are not designed with transparency and interruptibility and some of these things in mind. So I've been in situations where it's like people are convinced that they need to put windows in the doors. And then when they go down to the classrooms, they realize that the solid wooden doors there were made by great great grandfather Yoder back in the day with the maple tree that came down. Right? There's all these kinds of things where you go, well, we can't put a window in that that door. It's too precious. There's things like that you just have to take into account, but you have to be committed to like doing the thing that's going to keep children safe, right? So you maybe you take that door down and you put in a different door that has a window in it. You don't damage the door. There's things like that you have to work through, but you do have to be intentional about physical spaces. And older buildings are often not they're not designed the same way newer buildings would, or things of that nature. So those are just a few challenges. The thing that I probably one of the Bible verses I quote more often in this role than any other time in my life is that this idea that Jesus said we're to be wise as serpents and harmless as doves. Like we need to be attentive, and for safe church and small congregations, some of this starts with common sense, right? A translation of that might be use common sense, but be streetwise, right? Yes, be trusting. Yes, be a loving community, and also realize that we don't know everything about everybody, so we need some basic policies and procedures keep people safe and can help keep people safe in the church. Um, yeah, I don't, that's all I have, Nancy. I don't know if you have any other words that you would like to say. We also have a few more minutes if there's any other
Yeah, if there's other questions
questions.
we haven't answered all, I have taken notes of some of the questions that we didn't quite answer with your name. So if you want to contact us later, we will do that, related to like sex offender attending your church or, well, there's one question here about whether, somebody. Well, we keep talking about being streetwise and being creative. Like, yeah, you talked about taking the maybe the door down that was built by someone very, very special kind of thing. You could also just keep the door open all the time and then make sure that you have somebody walking through the
Then
hallway.
the children, like the little children run away, Nancy. They're quick.
There you can put a gate across the opening so they can't get out. That's how you can do
Well,
that.
some of them are
There's
also pretty spry, like one leg over the gate and they're down the hallway, and then you're stuck behind the gate because you can't get.
you
We
can
laugh
jump
too.
over.
I will say this. Sometimes you do have to laugh around this
Yeah,
stuff.
we do have to laugh. But being practical, there's one here that asks about when, they're traveling with someone that lives quite a distance away. Do there have to be two people in the car? And this is, traveling for a challenged adult who's in their 50s. I know there's been some creative ways that some people have done that when they haven't had two people available, is that the person will call and let somebody know they are picking up this person, and about the time they're supposed to be to the next place. And so they keep informed by telephone as coming and going, so that there can be maybe a way of providing some additional accountability if it's only one person in the car. There can be some creative ways of using your phone or your FaceTime with the person, letting them talk to someone while you're driving, whatever. Anyway, um, yeah, so I don't know that I have much more except, you know, don't think create the whole big policy that covers everything, but begin where you can begin and be willing to reach out to others and asking for some help. And we are here to help you in any way we can. So, if was there another question here? Have you yeah, okay.
I'm responding to you too.
Okay, you can respond to that one. Okay, just so you know, we did put a few things, Cami, who's our tech person tonight, which we're very grateful for. And then we have two persons who are translating in Spanish for us. So these things are always in Spanish, and we want to thank the three of them to help make this webinar possible. We have put some resource links into this document for you. And as we told you earlier, once this is uh, made into a recording, then you will get a link to that to use for that. There's a number of other resources that we have available for you, either through, well, besides we've said Safe Church, our prevention accountability resource, the Corinthian plan, assurance, small congregations. You may want to check. We have a new person working with that, Susan Burkholder, who is out of Colorado, and she's just begun. And so, if you're wanting to look at that as a small congregation to be aware of. Also, our group does provide a piecemeal that gives you the latest on things that are going on within the church. And so we want to point you to that as well. Um, anyway, so I guess unless there are other questions, do you have anything more, Michael? I'm going to then give us a blessing to go from here.
Good. Thank you.
Okay. Well, again, thank you for being here. We really appreciate, and we do care about you. That's why we were offering this. And so please feel free to contact us. No question is too stupid. And you may be giving, your question may help us to think of something else that we need to be looking at or that other churches are dealing with. And it might be a new webinar that we come up with. So anyway, as you go from this place, know that you are loved by God, that God may bless your commitment to the church and to your congregation. May God give you some new insights and vision for doing what is reasonably possible within your congregation, and know that you're not going it alone. So take care, and thank you for joining us tonight.